Hi, I'm Xanthe Brooke, and I'm the former Curator of Continental European Art at National Museums Liverpool. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a painting in the Atkinson Art Gallery in Southport. I'm going to be talking to you about this painting, The Triumph of Art, an allegory in which the classical god Apollo and figures representing the visual arts celebrate those arts in front of a portrait of the French 17th century politician Jean-Baptiste Colbert, painted by a French 17th century artist, Nicolas Pierre Loir. I'll be discussing the artist and the patron Colbert, who commissioned the painting, and why they make it such an important historical painting. I'll also be saying something about how this important French Baroque painting may have found its way to Southport, and I'll finish by talking a bit about its recent conservation by my former colleagues at National Museums Liverpool. Now, first of all, who was Loir? He wasn't a well-known artist. I'm not going to be claiming that for him. I'm showing you a portrait that might possibly be Loir by a fellow colleague artist, Xanthe, showing Loir at the height of his career in the 1670s, at a time when he worked with a team who decorated the suites of rooms with ceiling and wall murals for the King, Louis XIV, at his palace at Versailles. And he worked under the King's chief painter, designer, and art theorist, Charles Lebrun. And from 1668, Loir received a regular salary from the king and was mostly employed on the decoration of royal buildings and projects, and also providing tapestry designs for the Gobelin factory run by Lebrun. Loir was the son of a Parisian goldsmith who trained as a painter and engraver initially in Paris with French artists, the older Simon Vouet and his contemporary Sébastien Bourdon. Now, both these artists had trained and worked in Italy. So it's not surprising then that Loir, when he was aged about 23, travelled to Rome in 1647, where he settled for about 2 years. And it was in Rome where he met Nicolas Poussin. Poussin had made his entire career in Rome and had become the great French classical style Baroque artist, and his work influenced Loir, as we'll see later on. In fact, being able to go to Italy to see and copy works by Poussin may well have been what encouraged Loir to go to Italy in the first place, and particularly to travel to Rome. By the time Loir returned to Paris in 1649, a small group of artists, including his previous colleague and mentor, Bourdon, had helped establish an academy, the Académie Royale of Painting and Sculpture. But Loir didn't join or apply to be admitted immediately to the Academy. Instead, in 1650, possibly using his father's connections and contacts in the Goldsmiths Guild, Loir gained the commission to paint an altarpiece for Notre Dame Cathedral, a commission that was awarded annually by the Goldsmiths Guild to up-and-coming young artists. And for the rest of the 1650s, Loir continued to paint devotional pictures and landscape to decorate the chapels and the houses of Parisian collectors. It wasn't until 1663 that he was admitted formally, received to the Academy. And like all artists being admitted to the Academy, Loir was expected to submit a reception piece as an example of his skills. In this case, he was asked for a battle scene, a particular battle scene, the taking of Dunkirk, in which the French and the British Cromwellian troops had unusually fought side by side to defeat the Spanish aided by British royalists. But for whatever reason, Loir didn't paint a battle scene. Instead, what Loir eventually submitted in 1666 was not a battle scene, but an allegorical composition illustrating the allegory of the foundation of the Académie Royale, in other words, the very academy that he was entering or had entered in 1663. In an allegorical painting such as this, all the figures represent or symbolize abstract concepts. So the winged and elderly gentleman at the back, who is half naked, is pulling back drapery to reveal the sister arts of painting and sculpture, and they can be identified as such because painting has next to her knee the palette, her picture palette, painter's palette, and also mahl stick with which she holds up her supports her paintbrush. Whereas on the other side, the sister art, her sister sculpture who leans on her, has at her feet a chisel and a mallet. The painting is also known as the allegory of the progress of arts in the reign of Louis XIV, as the sister arts, painting and sculpture, are shown honouring a portrait of Louis XIV, who is being carried up heavenwards by Fame blowing her trumpet, and Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, but also the arts and crafts, especially of weaving. And Minerva is reminding painting and sculpture that the king is the ultimate protector of the fine arts via his patronage of the Academy. As you can see, it looks very similar, but with significant differences to the Atkinson's painting, also an allegory. The Roman god Minerva is replaced by the Greek and Roman god Apollo, who is god of the arts, including music, hence his holding a lyre. He is also god of the sun, and as the sun god, he was symbolically linked to Louis XIV, who was known as the Sun King from 1661. Even as a 15-year-old, Louis had adopted Apollo, the sun god, as his alter ego, almost as an avatar. And you can see here this design for a costume that he wore as dressed as the god Apollo for a ballet, a court masque. And he quite often appeared in such masks in the guise of Apollo. In the Atkinson painting, Apollo is surrounded by a group of female figures, all representing different forms of visual arts, not just painting and sculpture, as in the allegory of the Academy, but drawing and architecture as well. And Loir has also divided up the art of painting into 4 different types of painting that the Academy had arranged in a hierarchy, from at the top as the most important type of painting because it was the product of the imagination and it focused on the human body, history or mythological painting, then followed by portraiture, landscape, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, still life or flower painting. The latter was at the bottom because although it painted straight from nature without figures. History painting was in fact a term invented by the French Académie to refer to pictures that illustrated subjects drawn from the classical Greek and Roman histories and mythologies of their gods, and also the Bible and the saints' lives. So on the right, to represent history painting, Loir shows a woman in sumptuous plum purple drapery and olive green robe standing to show Apollo a canvas illustrating the origin of painting, as told in the classical story written by the ancient Roman author Pliny the Elder in his Natural History. He told of how the art of painting was invented when a young woman drew a silhouette around the shadow of her lover cast on a wall, so that she could have a memento of him when he went away. Now, Loir, however, has edited out the woman and has instead shown a young man drawing around his own shadow, creating a self-image. Over on the left, a woman dressed in salmony red points to a still life painting of flowers at the bottom of the Academy's hierarchy. And behind is a canvas of a dark landscape. And next to still life, dressed in a blue robe and beautifully depicted embroidered dress, is an artist copying the portrait of Colbert. So she represents portraiture, but she's also doing it by laying in the underdrawing with white chalk in a porte crayon. Architecture is represented in the background on the left by an elevation of a building, possibly Colbert's own country house, a Chateau of Sceaux, on the southwestern outskirts of Paris, which Colbert had bought in 1670 and had then started to enlarge it. And if you compare the painting, Loir's painting, and the sketch of the elevation of the architecture, it does look very similar to the 17th century print of the Chateau of Sceaux. Finally, in front on the left edge of the painting, you have the representation of sculpture carried in by a woman and a child who are carrying in a very famous ancient Roman fragment of sculpture called the Torso Belvedere, a muscular male nude in marble, which had actually been dug up and been in a collection in Rome since about the 1430s. At their feet, again, is a sculptor's mallet and a chisel. In the centre, we have a winged child who is beating down vigorously on a half man, half goat figure, a satyr, who probably represents ignorance, and the child, the winged cherub, genius or culture. Ignorance is sprawled over a portfolio of red chalk drawings. Now, satyrs were followers of the god of Pan, who also had links to Apollo, because Pan had once challenged Apollo in a musical competition between Pan's lewd panpipes and Apollo's elegant and graceful stringed lyre, which Apollo had won. So the satyr, who is sprawled directly below Apollo, also brings us neatly back to Apollo, who holds centre stage as the god of the arts, and also, of course, alter ego of Louis XIV. Apollo also indicates towards Colbert, as represented by an oval portrait. So he acknowledges Colbert as a patron of the arts, but by looking down towards painting, he encourages Colbert to in turn acknowledge the origin of painting and the triumph of all the visual arts. But who was Colbert that he should feature so prominently in this painting? I'm showing you a miniature painted in the 1670s after a larger painting by Pierre Mignard, painted around the time when Colbert acquired the chateau at Sceaux. Now, Loir's admission to the Academy in 1663 coincided with Colbert's meteoric rise in all matters of state and culture between 1661 and 1666. From 1661 until his death in 1683, Colbert was the king's chief financial advisor, ultimately instrumental in reforming the arts to benefit France's economy and glorify the king. From 1664, as Surintendant des Bâtiments, he was in charge of the construction and decoration of the Crown's buildings, including Versailles, and so he was a form of Minister for the Arts. And in 1665, he was appointed head of the Treasury followed by the judiciary, the navy, commerce and industry, as well as being head of various academies of performing arts and sciences, such as dance, science, music and architecture. It was Colbert's skillful development of French natural resources that enabled Louis XIV to fund the extraordinary expense of building Versailles, into which he moved himself and the court in 1672. Colbert and his wife even had to make arrangements for the care of the king's illegitimate children. Until his death, Colbert remained the king's key advisor on all matters of importance, whether political, economic, religious or artistic. As Minister of Finance, one of the key elements of Colbert's economic policy was to boost the French economy by regenerating the arts and culture. Now that sounds familiar to our ears nowadays in the light of the Liverpool city centre's regeneration after the European capital of culture. Well, it's not new, and Colbert effectively invented the idea. The fine arts were placed under the most complete state control ever exercised until the 20th century and the Nazis and Stalin's Soviets. For example, Colbert saw the arts as a vehicle for national economic revival. And for example, the Gobelin Tapestry Factory, founded in 1662, didn't just produce tapestries, but all the necessary furniture and furnishings for the crowns, palaces. It was due to the combination of Louis XIV, Colbert, and the artists such as Charles Lebrun and his assistants such as Loir that France, and especially Paris, replaced Rome as the artistic centre of Europe by the late 17th century, a position that arguably it retained until the second half of the 20th century. In particular, Colbert helped establish a luxury fashion industry with the aid of the king as a fashion plate. They introduced a rigid schedule whereby new fabrics were issued twice a year in spring and autumn, not just warmer and cooler clothes to reflect the change in weather, but totally new colour schemes and styles which courtiers of both sexes were pressured to follow by the king's example. In other words, Colbert helped create the fashion season split into the spring and autumn that we still have today. This increased productivity in the important French textile sector, especially the Lyon silk industry in southern France. And by fostering the manufacture of luxury goods, Colbert helped enshrine France as the world leader in taste and made Paris the centre of fashion trade in the 17th century Europe. Colbert himself commented that fashion is to France what gold mines are to the Spaniard. All of this must have influenced the appreciation of colour, sumptuous textiles and diverse fabrics, silks, brocades and embroidered dresses and fashionably styled hair that are evident in Loir's paintings. And now it's very evident why a portrait of Colbert should feature so prominently in this allegory of the triumph of art. But Colbert also left France and us a much darker legacy. For right at the end of Colbert's career, in 1682-3, he set up the committees that drew up the cruelly racist and anti-Semitic Code Noir, which notoriously codified the cruel punishments meted out to black slaves in the French Empire and expelled Jews from the French colonies, ostensibly to make the sugar plantations run more economically and efficiently. When the code was imposed in 1685, 2 years after Colbert's death, it was probably well after Loir painted The Triumph of Art. But when did Loir paint The Triumph of Art? Was it painted at the same time as he presented the allegory of the foundation of the Académie in 1666? Or did Colbert commission Loir to paint a variation on the theme later to decorate the Château de Sceaux when he had acquired it in 1670? Or did he commission it in 1672 when Colbert was made the Académie's protector and thus formalised his position as a patron for visual arts? We'll possibly never know, but my personal opinion is that these two paintings, the two allegories, were not painted at the same time, nor intended to be to hang together. They're certainly not considered as pendants because they're not the same size. And it is highly unlikely that Colbert would have commissioned Loir for a larger painting than the King's and the Academy's, with a similar allegorical composition to the foundation of the Academy, as it would have been deemed a breach of etiquette, to say the least, and may even have aroused the anger of the King, which was a very dangerous thing to do, as Colbert knew well, because of what had happened to Colbert's immediate precursor as French finance minister, the extremely wealthy Nicolas Fouquet, whom the King had sacked and imprisoned on discovering that he had been using royal artists and garden designers to lavishly decorate his chateau and gardens. At Colbert's death in 1683, Fouquet was still in prison. So Colbert was always careful not to fall foul of the King's jealousy. He was too canny an operator to do that. Under Colbert as protector of the Academy, it was reorganised and regimented. Members such as Loir were to keep to a strict set of rules governing the theory of painting, and as we've already heard, there was a new hierarchy of the genres of painting. The artist director, Charles Urbain, began to codify human gestures and facial expressions via a series of published lectures. All of this had an impact on Loir's compositions. And you can see here how, with a representation of Lebrun's anger from one of his illustrated lectures on the expression given in 1668, the same sort of heavily emphasized brow can be seen on the winged genius, the cherub, who is battering down on ignorance. Above all, Poussin became the artist who was the role model for the Academy's lectures and the pupils. He established the style they were to follow, and also the sort of colour regimes that they followed. So Poussin's influence was felt not just in balanced compositions and classical subject matter, but also on the use of very Poussin-esque colour schemes, often vivid pigments and hues. I'm showing you the Adoration of the Golden Calf by Poussin, with typical Poussin colour combinations of bright blues, salmony reds and pinks, lemon yellows and olive or sage greens. Poussinists like Loir learned how Poussin would use colour for decorative effect by juxtaposing hues such as blue and yellow, red and green to heighten each other's brilliance. Many centuries later, of course, Impressionists used the theory of complementary colours in their own paintings. Now we know that Loir's allegorical portrait of Colbert was last documented in Paris in an inventory of the Académie drawn up in 1794, where both his allegory of the triumph of art and his allegory of the foundation of Academy were stored together in 1794. By 1798, his allegory had been sent to Versailles, where during the French Revolution, art confiscated from palaces and churches, including all the reception pieces submitted to the Académie in the 17th and 18th century, were displayed in grand galleries as a form of museum. However, in November 1799, part of Versailles became a hospital for wounded soldiers, and the pictures started disappearing from the walls. And by 1804, when Napoleon came to power, the paintings had been dispersed and the museum closed. So how did Loir's allegory get to Southport? Now we need to go back to what had happened in the 18th century to the reputation of French 17th century paintings. By mid-18th century, even Poussin had fallen from favour in France. And in fact, in the mid-18th century, the French collector Pierre-Jean Mariette said that Poussin's paintings were very rare in French private collections. Instead, quotes, these works were being enthusiastically welcomed by English connoisseurs. British collectors, especially aristocrats, conceived a passion for Poussin. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, about half of Poussin's output passed through Britain. Even today, England owns as many Poussins as France does. And pictures by less well-known French 17th century painters, such as Loir, also went to Britain as a result of the mass shipping of pictures out of France during and just after the French Revolution. In northwest England, from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century, there was a tradition of collecting old masters, especially 17th century French art. And you can see this if you look at the collections of the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. I'm showing you three French 17th century masterpieces from the Walker Art Gallery, two by Poussin and one by Charles Le Brun. And by 1782, the 12th Earl of Derby at Knowsley on the outskirts of Liverpool owned one of Poussin's most important paintings and one of his most important landscapes, the landscape with the gathering of the ashes of Phocion, from his mature period in 1648. Now, by the 19th century, the Earl was the largest and richest landowner in Lancashire and Cumberland. The Walker also owns a very early Poussin from about the mid-1620s, which also has a prestigious French provenance and connection, as it was formerly in the collection of the 18th century Prince de Conti. And it was acquired by the Liverpool Royal Institution, a precursor of the Walker Art Gallery, between 1836 and 43. Le Brun's Atalanta Meleager of 1658 was actually painted as a preparatory design for a Gobelin tapestry and was presented to Liverpool City Corporation in 1852 by a London antique dealer who told the council that the painting had formerly belonged to the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was King of the Netherlands between 1806 and 1810. Now, the Walker Art Gallery had opened in 1877. The following year, in 1878, Southport's Art Gallery, with 3 spacious rooms for paintings and 6,000 feet of hanging space, also opened, funded by William Atkinson. By the late 19th century, Southport was the Paris of the Northwest, famed for its quality clothes shops, department stores, covered arcades and streets along which to window shop and promenade in sun or rain. The triumph of art's earliest known provenance in Southport was in 1889, when it was in the hands of a Samuel Hardman of Lord Street, Southport. The following year, 1890, Alderman Richard Nicholson presented it to the Atkinson. Now, who was Samuel Hardman, and how might he have acquired the painting? According to the 1881 census, in the upper right corner, Samuel Hardman was living in 32 Row Lane in North Mells, but was aged only 18 in 1881. So he was an unlikely art collector. But he had already started a career as an auctioneer's clerk. His father, Joseph, had retired to Southport with his family and 5 children, sometime after 1851, having made his money running a brickmaking factory in Oldham. Perhaps like William Atkinson, who funded the building of Southport's Art Gallery, he had moved to Southport for the healthy, fresh seaside air. The fact that Hardman Sr. could afford to retire at all, aged only 53, suggests that he was wealthy. And this was confirmed when Joseph died on the 31st of January 1888. His estate was worth just over £5,000, which roughly nowadays in buying power is well over £660,000, and as a share of GDP is actually in the millions. So when the following year after his father died, in 1889, a 25 or 26-year-old Samuel Hardman gave the painting to Alderman Richard Nicholson and then to Southport's Atkinson Art Gallery. It may have been as a gift from the retired wealthy businessman Joseph Hardman via his son. By 1890, the following year, Samuel had become a fully fledged auctioneer of art and real estate at 225 Lord Street, in other words, directly opposite the Atkinson. He was successful enough to be the only auctioneer to advertise in the local street directory, though still living at 32 Row Lane in a house called Kingswood with his widowed mother. We also know further information about Samuel Hardman. In November 1893, Samuel Hardman of 225 Lord Street was elected a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and in 1896 he became a Fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society. So obviously he had a scientific as well as artistic interests. Significantly and rather dramatically, also in February 1896, a Samuel Hardman, who was a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, sold at auction in Cardiff his, quotes, renowned collection of art. The interesting thing about this sale was A, that it was held in Cardiff, not Southport, where Hardman still had an auction house, and B, that it was almost entirely and very unusually full of French paintings, sculpture and decorative arts from the 17th through to the late 19th century. Why was the sale was due to his, quotes, shortly leaving England. We don't know why. Was he about to go on an expedition? Not sure. But certainly by 1900 he was no longer living in Southport but at Parbold, and had moved his auction room away from the centre of town of Southport. But he must have continued to be a successful auctioneer, as in the 1911 census he was living in a large 10-room house in Birkdale, a widower but with 2 sons born in Parbold. Now, so far I've been referring to the Atkinson's painting as by Loir. However, at the time that Samuel Hardman gave it to the Atkinson Art Gallery in 1890, it was not attributed to Loir, but to a Flemish contemporary of Loir's, the Antwerp-based Willem van Erp the Elder, who was known not for large canvases with allegorical subjects, but for small devotional pictures and low-life scenes of daily life on copper panels. But by the 19th century, many lesser-known French painters, 17th century French painters such as Loir, had fallen into neglect. Their reputations were not known about, and their work was prone to reattribution. So where had the Loir/Willem van Erp painting been between circa 1804 Versailles and 1880s Southport? Fortunately, although the painting, even though wrongly attributed, is an unusual subject, so it's more easily traced through auction catalogues. And one possible candidate, which I'm suggesting for the Atkinson painting, masquerading as a Willem van Erp, which seems to have gone through the auction sales rooms twice at the beginning of the 19th century, is a, quote, a Mercury riding his car, distributing vanities to the mortals below, the arts and sciences in the foreground, a very singular and curious specimen, which was bought in other words, it was left unsold, at the London auction rooms of Edward Foster on the 16th of December 1818. It had been put up for sale by somebody called Johnson, supposedly a gentleman retiring to Italy, and the painting was supposed to have come from the Netherlands. Possibly the same painting, Mercury crowning the arts, was sold in an Antwerp auction house for 13 francs on the 21st of May 1838. So there's a painting that may have been floating around the art market between England and Belgium and the Netherlands in the first half of the 19th century. The painting, the Atkinson's painting, wasn't attributed to Nicolas Loir until well over a century later, in the 1990s, by Jennifer Montague, a leading British expert on French 17th century painting once Anthony Blunt had died in 1983. And you can see why she made her attribution when you compare these two Loire paintings details, the Puteaux cherub from the Triumph of Art with the Christ child in the Hermitage's Holy Family within a floral garland. Both show Loire's, quotes, great talent for painting women and children, noted in an 18th century guide to the art and architecture in Paris and its surroundings. And as Jennifer Montague herself wrote, it also shows, his paintings also show his delight in complex hairstyles caught up by ribbons and golden ringlets, which occur in many of his works. Now, at the time when Jennifer Montague made her attribution on documentary and stylistic evidence, she was actually looking at black and white photos. So, for example, the landscape painting, which is still fairly dark even after conservation, read to her on a black and white photo as a blackened block of stone. She was also looking at photos of a very damaged and frameless and only partly conserved canvas, as an earlier project to fully clean the painting had run out of grant funds in the 1970s. It was in this damaged state that I first saw it with a French art historian, Moana Veil-Courriel, in about 2002. And it was only when much later a curator at Colbert's former chateau at Sceaux approached the Atkinson about the possibility of borrowing the painting for an exhibition being planned to celebrate in 2019 the 400th anniversary of Colbert's birth, and willing to provide the funds to complete the conservation of the painting. And of course, the Southport Art Society agreed to pay for a new frame in a Louis XIV style, and it was only then that the conservation could proceed. And I'm showing you now some of the photos of the cleaning and conservation in progress and the difference it made to the canvas. The work was undertaken by Harriet Owen Hughes in the snazzy jumper, and her colleagues Sheila Walthew on the right, and the frame conservator and constructor Germaine Den on the left. And it took place in the studios provided by National Museums Liverpool. It was only after their extensive skilled conservation that it was ready to make its grand appearance at the exhibition at Sceaux in the autumn of 2019. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that it was well worth all the effort to restore and revive this important French 17th century painting to its former glory. Thank you.